We are thrilled to be joined once again by former European professional soccer player and United States international, Maurice Edu. Mo, thanks so much for joining us again, man.
Yeah, of course, man. Looking forward to it. Good to see you guys yet again.
One of my coworkers is a alumnus of the University of Maryland, and I told him that
Oh,
I
so I
was
love him
interviewing
already.
you. He's like not a big soccer guy, but he was there. He was in school the same time as you. I think he might have been like a year or two younger than you, but he remembers watching you play and was telling me all the guys on that team. And I didn't realize how many pros that you had on that squad when you were in school.
Yeah, we had a decent, so I stayed for 3 seasons and literally every year we had at least, I think, two or three guys who went into the draft and turned pro. And then my my year and the class after me, there's a decent amount of guys who ended up turning pro. So yeah, Sasha does an incredible job over there. He does an incredible job of not only recruiting but then preparing players for that next step. So hats off to him, that program, and then the individual players as well, because you have to put in the work too to get to that stage. So proud to be a Terp, and I'm always quick to point them out whenever they're in the game that we're calling. So
All right. Well, we are having you on because you and Keith Costigan will be calling Austin's game in Seattle on Wednesday. But then I looked back at your kind of record for the season and saw that you and Keith have called Toronto twice. And so I kind of asked you before we jumped in if you could talk a little bit about Toronto with us as well. So sorry for springing that on you, but thank you for being flexible. Jumping into Seattle, they are currently first in the Western Conference on 23 points. They're 4-1-1 at home. They are second in the West in goals for, tied for second lowest in the West for goals against. So if we are gonna catch them at a
pretty bad
moment,
team, right?
yeah, terrible team,
Yeah, I
terrible
know.
team.
Yeah, it's exactly
If
what
we're
Austin need right
if
now.
if we were gonna catch them at a moment in the season, though, like now's kind of the time, right? I think they won maybe one out of four, and then they lost in the Open Cup. They have a lot of injuries right now. Um, Barely squeaked out a win against a nine-man Houston the other day. And so they have a lot going on. But out of everyone, Austin knows better than to underestimate a Seattle team that is down on their luck. I don't. You probably don't remember this game, Mo, but Austin fans will. In 2021, Seattle came into Austin. Was that a midweek game, Jeremiah?
It was yes, it was a midweek game because I got a bunch of people together who didn't watch soccer to convince them that this was going to be the game to like convert them to MLS, and
To
they watched
change them.
Austin. Yeah,
they,
and
they
they were
played like
absolutely like,
six teenagers, just like
yeah,
uglied up the game as long as they could. Put in Rui Diaz in the the 60th minute, and he scores a banger from nearly midfield to put him up 1-0, and that's the end of the game. That's how it ended. It was like, okay, so they
Numbers
are
right.
down on their luck in the moment, but Austin knows not to underestimate them in that situation. They've I mentioned they do have some injuries though. So Leo Chu, Nuhu, Christian Roldan, Raul Ruiz have all been out recently. They might have one or two of those guys back, but just talking about teams in this league who have that next man up mentality, just like stick to the system. Okay, this guy's out. Who's next? Put him in. Seattle is amazing at that and have been for several years now under Brian Schmetzer. So, like, do you think, like, does it matter that they're down on their luck right now? I feel like it doesn't.
Uh, no, it really doesn't. And it's part of what you just said there, right? Like Seattle has this ethos of next man up, right? And that next man up, you see that across so many different teams. They try to adopt that same kind of mantra and that same kind of approach to games and to injuries and to form and to whatever changes to a team's personnel. Doesn't always work, doesn't always come to fruition. I think with Seattle, one thing that makes them such a difficult team, even when, as you mentioned, you just rattled off a list of starters, starters who are potentially not available for the next match. One thing about this group is they have a really strong core. They have a clear identity of who they are. And at Lumen Field, they are a difficult team to beat. Now, Sporting Kansas City went there. What was it, last Sunday? We were actually on that game, on that call too. And Keith and I kind of labeled it as potentially a trap game for Seattle because so many things were favoring them to win that game. Sporting Kansas City was chasing their first win of the season. There was their first game where they had all three DPs fit. Sporting Kansas City, I'm talking about. But all those things, they were coming into the game poor form. Seattle was a team in good form, so you were thinking, okay, this is just going to be that they should roll them in this game, right? If form and all those kind of stats and narratives tell you anything, that's what the outcome should have been. So I say all that to say that Austin comes into this game in a similar vein of form as Sporting Kansas City were. I think it's 8 games now that they haven't won a game. But amongst them, they'll believe that they still have players who can make the difference, players who can score goals, players who can change the game, players who can win the game. So ultimately, it's about just going out there and weeding out all the noise, weeding out whatever we're going to say about them, and just focusing on the task, believing in the group that they have there on the pitch, and saying, you know what, this could be the game that now changes. This could be the turning point for our season. This could be the game that now gets us to believe that these 1-1, these 2-2 games, these narrow, games these draws that feel like losses, or, draws that feel like wins, they actually now are turned into victories. They are turned into wins. So this could be a turning point in some ways for Austin. If they go to Seattle and beat them, I think that could instill a whole new feeling and different belief within this Austin squad.
Well, Austin's got a really busy several weeks, but there was a Wednesday, Saturday. This is a Wednesday, followed by a Saturday. I'm guessing at some point in your career you dealt with something like that. Like as a player, like how do you mentally approach that kind of schedule congestion, and like how does that change? How does that change like multi-week games versus just playing Saturday for you?
The biggest change is just your week's cadence, right? Like if you're playing Wednesday, Saturday, Wednesdays, like if you're on that kind of cadence, then it just breaks up what training looks like for you most days. So if you're playing on a Saturday, you'll come in. If you're coming in on a Sunday, it's going to be a recovery day. So you'll have like the Monday, Tuesday training as opposed to like a full week of training. But you'll have the Monday that's like a harder day. Tuesday's going to be a light day because it's the day before a game. So I think that's just the biggest change, is that your week is broken up into a different cadence. But in all honesty, I mean, sometimes it's depending on the player you talk to, they'll see it as a benefit or as a hindrance to have that many games in quick succession when you aren't in form. I look at it and I say, I want that next game. I want that next game to come, because especially if you leave a game and you feel like we were that close. So for example, the Austin, their last match against Dallas, right? They get a red card and then they concede a goal in the dying minutes. They probably felt a little bit hard done in that game. Like they'd given enough effort. They'd done enough to maybe at least get a point out of that game. So to drop points in those final minutes, losing a derby match, you want a game to come pretty quickly so you can get that out of your head, get back on the pitch, and show that last game, there were some maybe different factors that kind of impacted that game and took those points away from you. So I look at it that way. And to be honest, those are things that you can't control as a player. You don't control the scheduling. You don't control when your next match is. There's other teams who are going to have the same kind of cadence of games. So I think as soon as you start putting it in your head that this is an issue, you start creating excuses. Excuses start to weigh on your mind. You start creating excuses for your performance before you even kick a ball. And I think that's the worst thing that you can do, especially when you're like not in the best form.
So I want to move on to Austin, but before we do, just to mention, Seattle has been playing a lot of new faces this season, but some of the old faces are performing really well. Jordan Morris has 8 goals, Nico Ladero 5 assists and a goal. Jao Paulo, I don't think has scored anything, but just having him back on the field is a big deal for them. Moving on to Austin, talking about them kind of feeling hard done by in certain ways and talking about their winless streak. Although they haven't won in a long time, the last 2 or 3 performances up until a red card have been more promising. They look like they could have won a game. We said on a recent show that there's certain goals or certain games that if they played those games over and over, they're going to lose every time. But the last 3 or 4 games they've played, if you play those over and over, you probably win some of them. And so we are kind of introducing some players back in from injury. One of the main ones being Diego Fagundes. Rodney Redes is out with a red card against Seattle. As a player coming back from an injury, did you have a preference of kind of like easing your way back in 20, 30 minutes at the end of a game or starting? Because Josh Wolf might be forced to start Diego Fagundes in this game.
Yeah. Wait, I'm going to get to that. I just wanted to put a button on Seattle. You listed off some of the veteran players who are playing well. You're right, but at the same time, they have some concerns of their own. I mean, if you look at their numbers over the last, I think it's like 5 or 6 games. I think it started with that Portland game when they lost 4-1. They haven't scored more than a goal in any of those games. Now, albeit I think they've won 2, drawn 1, and lost 2. So kind of like an even, almost like 500 record in those 5 games. But in terms of their output and scoring goals, and with all the pedigree and the quality that they haven't been able to score more than 1 goal per game, right? And so like I'm just putting more things out there as to what Austin should be looking at and thinking like, okay, look, we know this team can be dangerous going forward. We know the weapons that they have, we know the threats that they have, but other teams have found ways to try to minimize that danger. So can we take a page out of that book and try to do the same thing when we go up there? Now, to your question about starting or coming off the bench, man, I'm a competitor. Just like every player that you're going to talk to, they're a competitor. You want to start. You want to play these minutes. And I think that's where the manager has to approach it from. He has to weigh the pros and cons of the situation, depending on what the injury was as well. If it's a muscle injury, sometimes you want to be a little bit more cautious with those because it's so easy to read. So you want to be a little bit more cautious at times because it's easy for these things to flare up again or for you to re-injure them. And so it becomes more tricky because of, like you just said, the desperation. Ronnie Redis is out now with the red card. Diego Fagundes has been a player over the years who's been incredibly impactful, especially during his tenure with Austin. So you're going to have that feeling to want to get him back on the pitch as quickly as possible. I know he was on the bench last game. So it's a difficult dilemma. I think obviously I think Josh Wolf will be smart. And if he feels like Diego's in a place to where he can actually start and play whatever it is, 60 minutes, 55 minutes, okay. But I don't think he's going to risk him starting a game, playing significant minutes if it's going to jeopardize the longer term availability of the player. But that being said, they need 3 points. There's that feeling of every game that now goes on where you're not picking up points, albeit the results or the actual games might have felt like, hey, we put in a good shift, we put in a good performance. You're ultimately graded based on if you get that 3 points at the end of the day, right?
Yeah, and so talking about the other wingers, so Redis is out. So you've got really, as far as like starting caliber guys, Fagundes, Finley, and Rigoni. Rigoni's played a lot of minutes over the last couple of weeks. And so if you start one of them, like if you start Fagundes, you're probably expecting to have to pull him out. And so if you start him, maybe you can't start Rigoni because you might have to pull him out too. And so I think it's a complicated thing for like decisions that Wolf's gonna have to make, just depending on how ready these guys' bodies are. But he said in the post-game press conference that there will be some rotations, but not expecting lots and lots of changes just for the sake of changing. That's a quote from him. So we'll see what it looks like. Talking about center backs for Austin, Radovanovic has come on as a sub in both in the Open Cup game and against Dallas. I think the guy looks the part. I'm not sure how much Wolf trusts him yet, just because he's been really slow to trust new guys coming into the team. But it almost like he's going to have to play some of these games. Jeremiah, do you have a preference on what we see from center backs, or any thoughts on that?
One of the things that we look at this upcoming Austin schedule, they're not obviously in a good run of results, but like I can see rotating in this one and looking at some of the games against clubs that should be less competitive or should be like more of a easy matchup. Not easy, no matchup is easy for Austin now, but like more of a competitive matchup for Austin. Like it may be rotating here and then like saving what you can for Toronto over the weekend, because 3 points is 3 points either way.
Yeah, I mean, I get that, but also like throwing a guy who's new to the league on in his first start away in Seattle midweek, like it seems a little mean, but like also like maybe it is the best time to do it. I don't know.
I mean, I was kind of in between. I guess I shared a little bit of both of your thought process there. I appreciate the way that you try to word that in terms of rotating. And I guess the better way we could say it is your next 2 games after Seattle are at home, right? And they're against a team that's at the bottom of the table, and then Chicago, who's like what, second or third from bottom, right? So those seem to be more favorable games and games that you should win, especially because they're at home. So we can put it that way. And I guess so. Like if you were gonna rotate, potentially that's. But my only fear, I guess I would say, or concern is when you rotate too heavily and it becomes pretty obvious to anyone looking at your personnel, looking at your team, your lineup. I always feel like that can sometimes have a negative impact on the team because it almost feels like, okay, we're conceding this game to try to win the next one. Right. And it's, of course, you're never doing that. You're never putting out a lineup that you don't think can win a game. But when you just make wholesale changes and it's you're going to Seattle, it's almost gives that feeling of like, all right, we're conceding. If we get something with this lineup, great. But the ultimate objective here is we have 2 home games after that. We need to pick up 6 points in those 2 games. And so I get that thinking. I get that logic. I just don't like it from a mentality standpoint of how it can shape the narrative for a group of players. And then the other part of it is, okay, let's say you make big changes, you drop points in Seattle. Now that puts even more pressure on those next 2 games at home, because if you don't pick up the points there, then it's like, well, this streak has continued and it's gone from here to here. It's just had that trickle down effect. So this is why I'm not a manager. This is why I'm here with you guys. I'd rather be in this seat than that one.
Yeah, I'm kind of think just based on the quotes from the post game the other day that Josh Wolf is thinking the same way that you are. It's just a matter of like which are the right changes to make. He'll make a few of them, but which are the right ones? Which guys can go? Which guys can't? Who can start? Who can't? So it's going to be interesting to see that starting 11 on Wednesday. Moving on to Toronto. So this is the first time that these teams are going to play competitively. I think they played in a preseason thing last year, maybe. But Toronto currently last in the Eastern Conference, 13 goals for, 17 goals against, and they're coming off 2 losses in a row to their rival Montreal, one in the Cup competition, one in the league. There is a lot of talent in this team. Even we'll talk about some injuries here in a second, but even with the injuries, there's a lot of really good players in this team. Why have they struggled so much this year?
Well, I do think a big part of it is some of the personnel. I mean, as much as you just said, there is still talent within this team, and you're right. But I think some of the players that have been out are, when you look at a team, right, you always start by building the spine of that team. And some of the players that they brought in to be a part of that spine, they brought in Sean Johnson. He's been fit. He's been playing. But I think, why am I blanking? Center back. Matt Hedges being out injured, I think, has been a massive loss for them. He started off the season well, and then you've seen a dip. And I think so. The games that we called the games against Atlanta in Toronto, and then Toronto came to Philly and played Philly. The Toronto-Atlanta game, they were the better team for large stretches of that game. What they failed to do when they got ahead was find that second goal, and then Toronto found a way to play themselves back into that game, and then. Still even a weird game because they score a goal literally the last kick of the game to draw the game. Now, when they went to Philly, it was completely just utter domination. And you started to really see the lack of some of these players. So there was no Matt Hedges. I believe Michael Bradley was out of that game. And Insigne had just come back into the team. So you saw a team that for large spells of that game looked lost. The way that they tried to defend was kind of like a 4-4-2. Pretty much giving Insigne and Bernardeschi the freedom to kind of just be a little bit more advanced and not have as much responsibility defensively. And I felt like that really disrupted and gave the edge to Philly in that game, and Philly took full advantage of that. When you have a team that's so, I guess, heavily dominated by superstars, so you have Insigne, you have Bernardeschi, so the ask of these 2 players is heavy. It's incredibly heavy. You're asking them to carry a large burden when it comes to creating in the final third, to be in the attacking outlets consistently, to be that spark, to be that game-changing talent. And when a team is able to quiet them, you look at the depth beyond that, and that's where the trickle-down effect starts to happen. You look at the last game, the players that started in that game versus Montreal. I mean, because of injuries and personnel not being available, Marc-Anthony Kaye drops out of midfield. He's now playing center back. They're playing in a 3-4-3. And so I think the drop off from that starting 11, maybe 12, 13 players is significant enough to where it's really caused them some problems. And I think ultimately has made Bob Bradley have to pivot in terms of whether it's tactics, whether it's how he deploys Bernardeschi and Insigne. It's just really made them have to shift and adapt in a way that they haven't looked very comfortable in.
Yeah, they also recently added CJ Sapong, so that's adding to their attacking talent. But talking about kind of them leaning into what players they have, you also mentioned a guy like Richie Larea, who is an attacking fullback slash wingback kind of player, which is great. But again, if you're have an injured central midfield, not great center backs or injured center backs at the moment, like an attacking fullback, as much as it adds you offensively, it leaves you exposed as well at times. And so, yeah, hopefully Austin can take advantage. Like you said, these are teams with Toronto and then Chicago in the Open Cup after that. Austin needs to take advantage of those, but hopefully we can also squeak out a result away in Seattle, which is something we've never done. Generally, we've never beat Seattle, right? I think a draw is as good as we've ever done.
That's as good as it's gotten. Yeah, that's been a tough go of it for sure. Mo, I wanted to ask, we've seen this. You mentioned Bob Bradley. We've seen this, like, maybe is Bob Bradley a coach in the hot seat kind of discussion. Like, do you think, is there a point in time where Bob Bradley becomes a coach on the hot seat with this club during this season, or where do you see that going?
Yeah, it's a tricky one, right? He's coached there, sporting director as well. I don't know. I think when you just look at and this is part of management, right? Having to deal with injuries and deal with different personnel. But again, I think when they're fully, I won't even say fully healthy, but when they have their 11, that is their strongest 11 on the pitch, I think it's a different team. I think it's a team that can compete with literally anyone in this league. And so when you just look back at their games, I don't know if they've had that even once yet this season. I'm not sure if they played the same, maybe the first couple weeks. I'm not sure if they played the same 11 yet.
It's been a lot of changes. I was looking over their 11s over the season. It's been a lot of changes.
Right. And so, I mean, to that end, I think when Toronto signed Bob and they gave him the keys to this team, to this organization, it was with the long-term plan in mind, right? That they knew that they needed to make some changes, bring in some pieces to really support and complement Insigne and Bernardeschi and the other players that they have in that squad. So as much as the results have not been favorable whatsoever, they're sitting bottom of the East right now. They've lost back-to-back games against Montreal, their rivals. I think all that does amplify and put more pressure on Bob. But I think that I won't say that he's comfortable. I think he'll be the first one to tell you that he knows what this role entitles and how you're judged based on this role. But I think that there's a little bit more leeway because there's a longer term vision involved with this hiring. And then also there's maybe a little sense of, damn, we recognize what you've had at your disposal to try to get this team playing in the way that you want them to play. So I don't want to make excuses because at the end of the day, every coach should be judged on their performance and the results that their team yields. But I just think that, again, with this hiring, there was a recognition that this is a long-term plan. And I think Bob's a guy that they trust will turn things around, especially when they have a healthy lineup.
All right. Well, yeah, Mo. Sorry. Go ahead.
I was going to ask one more thing. Like, was he the national team coach when you were on the national team?
Yeah,
for most of the time. And you played at Toronto, right? So you got a lot of connections here now.
I got ties of both. Yeah. So I guess
Toronto was your first professional club, right?
Yeah. 2007. Yep. That's where it all started for me. So.
All right, well, try to be super objective when you're calling like Toronto and Bob against Austin for us. We love it. I know you will be. Don't worry about it.
All right. Well, Mo, thanks so much for joining us again. We appreciate it as always. And again, listeners, you can hear Mo and his partner Keith Costigan on the call on Apple TV when Austin is in Seattle. Mo, thanks for joining us again, man.
No problem, man. Thanks for having me, guys.